Adolf Hitler, the 52-year-old dictator of Nazi Germany, reads the incoming telegram detailing the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor and openly rejoices in front of his stunned staff officers. He steps out of his heavily fortified bunker into the freezing winter air, energized by the sudden destruction of the American Pacific Fleet. "We cannot lose the war at all," he announces to his inner circle, his words recorded by surviving aides. "We now have an ally who has never been conquered in 3,000 years. 4 days later, Hitler steps up to the podium at the Reichstag and officially declares war on the United States. It is a sudden, irreversible decision that seals the fate of his empire, driven by a catastrophic intelligence failure regarding American capabilities. What did the Axis command actually believe? They believed the Pacific crisis would completely paralyze Washington. Post-war interrogations of German and Japanese intelligence officers reveal a shared fatal delusion. The Axis High Command looked at the globe and saw the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans not as American highways, but as massive logistical prison walls. They calculated that fighting a two-ocean war would instantly drain the United States of merchant shipping, steel, and aviation fuel. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his naval planners banked heavily on the assumption that a crippled America would recoil in shock. They expected Washington to pull all its Atlantic convoy escorts back to defend the California coastline, effectively leaving Europe to burn. The raw data in December 1941 seemed to prove the Axis right. Across the globe in Washington, the reality is incredibly bleak. The United States military is fundamentally unprepared for a localized conflict, let alone a global bloodbath. At the exact moment Japanese bombs fall on Hawaii, the United States Army ranks 17th in the world in size. The American ground forces are actually smaller than the military of Romania. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, operates on mere hours of sleep in a heavily guarded war room. He reviews the relentless casualty reports flowing in from Hawaii, Guam, and the rapidly collapsing Philippines. Smoke is still rising from the shattered, burning hulls of the battleships trapped at Ford Island. Exactly 2,403 Americans are dead. The American public is enraged, screaming for immediate Japanese blood. The political pressure to hurl every available soldier, ship, and aircraft directly into the Pacific theater is absolute. Hitler counts on this exact emotional reaction. German U-boat commanders are already shifting their crosshairs toward the American coastline, preparing to sink millions of tons of shipping. If Marshall and President Franklin D. Roosevelt divert their limited production lines strictly to avenge Pearl Harbor, the British supply lines will collapse. Great Britain will be starved into submission within months. The entire Axis strategy relies on America fighting a divided reactionary war of panic, but Marshall refuses to take the bait. Sitting in the munitions building, he looks at the global map with cold, detached arithmetic. He recognizes that Germany possesses the heavy industry, the slave labor, and the scientific base to dominate Europe permanently if left unchecked. Japan, despite its massive territorial gains, is fundamentally resource poor. The Axis leaders completely misunderstand the American capacity for strategic discipline. They expect a fractured emotional retaliation. Instead, the United States begins drafting a blueprint for total, synchronized warfare across both hemispheres. The physical challenge is terrifying. Marshall knows the United States currently lacks the troop transports, the escort destroyers, and the artillery to sustain even one active front, let alone two simultaneously. The American industrial base is still struggling to transition from manufacturing civilian sedans to assembling medium bombers. The time window to save Britain while holding a defensive line in the Pacific is rapidly closing. A massive deadline approaches. The British Prime Minister is secretly crossing the freezing, U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic aboard a battleship. He is heading straight for Washington. The ticking clock toward the first combined Anglo-American strategy conference, codenamed Arcadia, will force a definitive ruling on the true direction of the American military machine. Hitler blindly assumes the Americans will tell the British they are abandoning the Atlantic. Japanese intelligence predicts a massive, panicked fleet buildup around Hawaii. Instead, Roosevelt and Marshall are about to finalize an operational directive that will completely shock Axis spy networks and initiate a logistical avalanche they never saw coming. Winston Churchill paces the floors of the White House, chain-smoking cigars and dictating memorandums deep into the night. Across the hall, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and General George C. Marshall finalize a decision that defies every standard military instinct. The American public is screaming for vengeance against Tokyo, demanding the immediate transfer of the entire United States Navy to the Pacific. To strip defenses from the West Coast now is widely considered political suicide. But Marshall and Roosevelt ruthlessly sign off on the Germany First doctrine. The United States will throw the bulk of its newly drafted army and industrial output into the Atlantic, treating the Pacific as a secondary holding action until the Nazi regime is crushed. In Berlin, this strategic pivot registers as an absolute impossibility. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, reviews the intelligence reports from Washington and completely misinterprets the American mindset. He later recorded in his memoirs his absolute certainty that the United States would immediately abandon its transatlantic supply lines to protect its own borders. Acting on this belief, Raeder deploys his U-boat fleet directly to the American eastern seaboard, launching Operation Drumbeat. Torpedoes rip into defenseless oil tankers just miles off the coast of Florida and New York. Burning debris and bodies wash up on American beaches. In just a few months, German submarines sink over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. The coastal bloodbath is staggering. Hitler watches the tonnage reports climb and assumes the inevitable. Will Washington break under the pressure? He expects Roosevelt to panic, recall the fleets, and barricade the continent. Instead, the Americans absorb the horrific losses and actually accelerate their European buildup. Marshall refuses to alter the global math. He understands that if the Soviet Union collapses and Britain starves, the Axis will control the industrial output of 2 entire continents. No amount of Pacific victories could save an isolated America from a unified fascist Europe. The German high command fails to grasp this cold, terrifying discipline. They are waiting for a structural collapse that simply never comes. Simultaneously, the Japanese Imperial General Staff makes their own fatal miscalculation. They assume the American Germany First policy means a completely abandoned Pacific front. But Marshall and Admiral Ernest King activate a dual-layered defensive strategy. Post-war interrogations of Japanese staff officers reveal they were completely blindsided by the sheer volume of material the United States managed to bleed into the Pacific while supposedly prioritizing Europe. In the first 6 months of 1942, American shipyards lay the keels for dozens of new aircraft carriers and escort vessels. The Japanese expect to fight a hollowed-out ghost fleet. Instead, American codebreakers and a patched-together carrier task force ambush the Japanese Navy at Midway, sinking 4 elite enemy carriers in a single morning. The news of Midway reaches Berlin, shattering the German illusion of a crippled America. Hitler's intelligence networks finally detect the massive logistical buildup happening in Great Britain. Millions of American crates, thousands of trucks, and heavily armed infantry divisions are pouring into English ports at an impossible rate. The two-ocean war plan is not a theoretical paper exercise. It is rapidly becoming a mechanized reality. The Axis leaders had bet their empires on the assumption that geographical distance would force America into strategic paralysis. Now they are staring at an enemy capable of taking devastating hits in both oceans without pulling back a single division. The window for Germany and Japan to link their empires and consolidate their conquests is violently slamming shut. Marshall is not just supplying Britain, he is actively staging a massive, unpredicted counteroffensive. Hundreds of troop transport ships are secretly gathering off the coasts of the United States and the United Kingdom, loaded with green but heavily armed American soldiers. They are preparing to execute Operation Torch, a massive amphibious invasion of North Africa. It will serve as the first undeniable physical proof that the United States military can bridge the Atlantic and punch straight into the Axis perimeter. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands aboard his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, reviewing the terrifying intelligence intercepts out of American shipyards. The raw data is physically impossible. Japan's heavy industry is already maxed out, struggling desperately to replace the 4 fleet carriers resting at the bottom of the Pacific after Midway. Yet the decoded intercepts claim the Americans are simultaneously laying the keels for over 24 new fleet carriers, while constructing thousands of merchant ships for the Atlantic. Yamamoto understands the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare better than anyone in the Japanese high command. The mechanical roar of the sleeping giant he feared waking is now deafening, but in Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff flatly refuses to believe the data. Are the Americans truly this productive? They officially classify the production reports as fabricated psychological warfare. It defies their entire military doctrine that a nation violently attacked just months ago could outproduce the Japanese Empire while simultaneously shipping entire field armies to Europe. Surviving post-war interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers reveal a culture of absolute systemic denial. Staff officers admit they deliberately doctored the American shipbuilding figures downward by more than 50% before presenting them in imperial briefings. They convince themselves that the United States is simply boasting to mask a deeply paralyzed war machine. Halfway across the world, Adolf Hitler makes the exact same fatal psychological error. Deep inside his command bunker, he listens to reports detailing massive new American bomber factories in Michigan and sprawling naval yards in California. Hitler waves the intelligence away with total contempt. He famously declares to his inner circle that the United States is merely a decayed country incapable of martial discipline, a delusion later documented in the diaries of his armaments minister. He assures his top generals that America can only mass-produce refrigerators and razor blades, not devastating engines of war. Will this delusion hold? It stands as one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in modern military history. By completely dismissing the sheer scale of the American two-front mobilization as pure Hollywood fiction, Hitler ignores the immediate need to heavily fortify his Atlantic coastal defenses and consolidate his violently overextended Eastern Front. The reality is far worse than either Axis leader can possibly comprehend. General George C. Marshall orchestrates an economic mobilization completely unmatched in human history. American factories transition to operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In 1942 alone, the United States manufactures exactly 47,836 military aircraft. The following year, that staggering number will nearly double to over 85,000. The geographic reality that Hitler and Yamamoto initially thought would break the United States, the massive isolating oceans, actually becomes America's greatest strategic shield. Protected entirely from enemy bombing campaigns, the American industrial base pumps millions of tons of steel, ammunition, and aviation fuel into two entirely separate, massive global pipelines. The Axis empires, conversely, are suffocating. German supply lines pushing deep into Russian territory are freezing solid under relentless pressure. Simultaneously, Japanese merchant ships are being actively hunted down and slaughtered by American submarines across the Pacific theater. The dual hemisphere strategy requires an astronomical daily burn rate of fuel and steel, and only one nation on Earth possesses the factory floor to sustain it. Marshall ruthlessly exploits this global advantage. He ensures that every time the Japanese attempt to reinforce an isolated Pacific atoll or the Germans try to resupply a battered North African garrison, they are met with a crushing, ever-increasing volume of American firepower. The strategic consequences of this denial are irreversible. Because Tokyo and Berlin refuse to acknowledge the incoming avalanche of steel, they leave their outer defensive perimeters dangerously thin. They stubbornly assume they have years to prepare for a weakened, divided, and exhausted American counterattack. They are catastrophically wrong. The American war machine is now fully assembled, heavily fueled, and pointed directly at both empires. The countdown to the brutal 1943 combat milestones is ticking down, bringing a massive influx of new Essex-class aircraft carriers and heavy bombers that are about to violently shatter the front lines. General George C. Marshall stands before the massive situation maps in the War Department, tracking rivers of blood and steel flowing in completely opposite directions. It is late 1943, and the American military machine is fully unleashed. Half a world apart, American forces are violently tearing into two heavily fortified enemy perimeters at the exact same time. In the Mediterranean, the United States Fifth Army wades through a hail of German artillery fire onto the beaches of Salerno, initiating a brutal, grinding campaign to push straight up the Italian peninsula. Simultaneously, 8,000 miles away in the Central Pacific, United States Marines hurl themselves into the horrific, concentrated crossfire of Tarawa. The casualties are sudden and catastrophic. Exactly 1,009 Marines are killed and over 2,000 wounded in just 72 hours on Tarawa's tiny coral reefs. In Italy, medical tents and hospital ships are rapidly overwhelmed by the shattered bodies of American infantrymen. The Axis High Command eagerly monitors these staggering casualty reports and waits for the inevitable political collapse in Washington. Will the Americans finally break? Hitler completely expects Marshall to panic and immediately freeze one of the offensives to conserve manpower. Instead, the United States simply accelerates the draft and pours fresh combat divisions straight into the fire. This relentless dual-hemisphere pressure violently shatters the foundational survival strategy of the Axis alliance. Hitler and the Japanese Imperial Staff had explicitly designed their heavily fortified defensive rings based on one core belief: that the United States would be forced to adopt a pendulum strategy. They firmly believed America would have to shift its limited fleets and armies back and forth across the globe, allowing the Axis to safely shift their own reserves to match the threat. Marshall's simultaneous offensives completely destroy this operational luxury. When German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring desperately begs Berlin for armored reinforcements to plug the bleeding Italian front, he is flatly denied. The German strategic reserve is utterly paralyzed, trapped fighting the Soviets in the east while bracing for an inevitable Allied strike in the west. In the Pacific, the terrifying reality of American logistical supremacy hits the Japanese command like a physical blow. Admiral Chester Nimitz drives his Central Pacific thrust forward with a massive armada that defies all pre-war logic. Japanese troops stationed on isolated atolls look out at the horizon and see dozens of brand-new Essex-class fleet carriers blotting out the sun. Surviving diaries of Japanese garrison commanders record their absolute paralyzing shock at the sheer volume of incoming naval gunfire. One captured Japanese staff officer later admitted during post-war interrogations that their entire defensive doctrine crumbled the moment they realized the Americans were replacing sunken warships faster than the Japanese could manufacture the torpedoes to sink them. The United States is not just matching Axis production, it is actively burying both empires under an endless, terrifying avalanche of heavy bombers, high-octane aviation fuel, and mechanized infantry. The geographic vice is now rapidly closing. The German Navy has fundamentally lost the Battle of the Atlantic, effectively suffocated by hundreds of newly built American destroyer escorts and long-range patrol bombers. Concurrently, the Japanese Imperial Fleet is being systematically hunted down and destroyed by an ever-tightening net of American submarines. Because the United States strictly refuses to abandon either theater of operations, the Axis powers are forced to bleed out on every single front simultaneously. There is no safe harbor, no quiet sector, and absolutely no strategic pause allowed to rebuild their shattered divisions. The two-ocean strategy has evolved from a desperate defensive holding action into an unstoppable, synchronized campaign of global annihilation. Marshall and his top commanders are now orchestrating a logistical supply chain that defies the limits of human history, moving millions of drafted men and millions of tons of cargo across heavily mined oceans without missing a single operational deadline. The ultimate, defining test of this terrifying capability is now straight ahead. The narrowing window to June 1944 is ticking down, a single month where the United States military will attempt the absolute logistical impossibility of launching two massive, world-altering invasions simultaneously. General George C. Marshall stands inside the Pentagon Communications Center, gripping two operational reports that represent the absolute pinnacle of human logistical achievement. In the English Channel, an armada of over 5,000 vessels is violently slamming into the coast of Normandy under heavy German artillery fire. Exactly 8,000 miles away in the deep waters of the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz is unleashing a staggering fleet of 15 fast aircraft carriers and over 500 warships directly at the Mariana Islands, carrying over 127,000 assault troops. The United States is executing the two largest amphibious invasions in global history at the exact same time. It is June 1944, and the American two-ocean war plan is operating at maximum terrifying capacity. Inside his East Prussian command bunker, Adolf Hitler stares at the casualty reports flooding in from the French coast. He had spent years betting his entire empire on the assumption that an American two-front war would mathematically collapse. Instead, over 150,000 Allied troops pour onto the Normandy beaches in a single day, backed by an uninterrupted pipeline of American steel and millions of tons of high explosives. The German Atlantic Wall, designed to bleed a desperate, fractured enemy, is instantly pulverized by thousands of heavy bombers that Hitler was repeatedly told did not exist. Post-war interrogations of the German High Command reveal the exact moment their delusion shattered. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later wrote that when he saw the sheer endless volume of American armor rolling off the specialized landing craft onto the French sand, he instantly knew the German war effort was completely doomed. Simultaneously, the Japanese Imperial General Staff receives a devastating radio transmission from the garrison command on the island of Saipan. The American invasion fleet stretches all the way to the horizon, raining down tens of thousands of heavy naval artillery shells onto the deeply dug-in Japanese defenders. The shock in Tokyo is absolute and paralyzing. How could the Americans afford this? They had completely weaponized their geographic isolation, building an untouchable industrial machine that was now actively outproducing the rest of the planet combined. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's earliest warnings are now a horrific, mechanical reality. Japan had banked its entire national survival on the United States, fighting a slow, rationed war of attrition, forced to constantly pull resources away from the Pacific to feed the European meat grinder. Instead, American factories are literally launching a new combat ship every single day. The Japanese outer defensive ring is not just pierced, it is completely annihilated by a unified bi-coastal military assault that never pauses to resupply. The Axis leaders made a fatal, foundational miscalculation in December 1941. They looked at the massive ocean separating the United States from Europe and Asia and saw an insurmountable logistical prison that would naturally bankrupt the American economy. They failed to understand that the American industrial mind would view those same oceans as a protected global highway. By forcing the United States to fight everywhere at once, Germany and Japan accidentally triggered a unified psychological and economic mobilization that forged the greatest supply chain the world had ever seen. The Axis powers mistook democratic debate for inherent weakness, fatally misunderstanding the American capacity for total, absolute war once the political decision was made to fight. As Berlin burns under relentless daylight bombing raids and Tokyo is systematically reduced to ashes by massive fleets of B-29 superfortresses, the final cost of this arrogance becomes physically undeniable. Millions of Axis soldiers are dead, their empires crushed under the weight of a logistical reality they stubbornly refuse to believe. The surviving records of the Japanese Supreme War Council document the ultimate despair of their commanders as the dual hemisphere squeeze violently tightened around their home islands. In a classified post-war interrogation, a high-ranking Japanese logistics officer perfectly summarized the fatal Axis delusion, stating to his American captors, "We were fighting a nation that could make an endless supply of iron float."